You think you know the woods. You think you understand what's hiding behind the trees and beneath the soil. But the wilderness doesn't care what you think. It doesn't care how prepared you are, how experienced, or how many trails you've hiked before. Out there, something ancient watches, something unnatural waits. And when it reveals itself, it doesn't always leave scars on the skin. Sometimes it burrows deeper, into your memory, into your fear. These 5 stories aren't about getting lost in the woods. They're about losing something worse, your sanity, your safety, and the belief that nature plays fair. Story 1, Dave and the Bear Trap. A few years back, me and 4 of my closest friends decided to finally take a camping trip we'd been talking about for what felt like forever. We had all grown up together, known each other since high school. Me, Rachel, then 23, and the others, Rob, Jenna, Jay, and Dave. Life had pulled us in different directions, scattered us across cities and jobs, but this trip was meant to be a reset, an escape from deadlines and city noise. We'd planned it for months, texting gear lists and trail maps, hyping each other up in late-night group chats. The idea of being far from civilization, just us and the trees, was something I craved more than I realized. There's something pure about stepping into a place where phones lose signal, where time bends around firelight and conversation. It felt like we were chasing something sacred. When we arrived at the trailhead, our packs were heavy with supplies, but our spirits were sky high. The sun was bright overhead, filtered through a sea of green as we moved deeper into the woods. It started out easy, a wide, worn path, birdsong in the trees, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. We laughed like we used to back in school, teased. Each other made stupid jokes. There was something innocent about those early hours, like we'd left the world behind and stepped into some untouched pocket of time. The forest rose and fell in shallow ridges, sometimes dipping into ravines before lifting again into hillocks. The deeper we walked, the quieter the outside world became. The occasional bird call or crunch of branches underfoot were the only reminders that we weren't completely alone. By late afternoon, we'd made decent progress and weren't planning to camp until closer to dusk. So we took a break in a small clearing beneath a low rise, nestled in the quiet. The spot was cozy, almost too perfect. Soft moss underfoot, scattered shafts of sunlight breaking through the trees. We dropped our packs, sprawled out, passed, around sandwiches and water bottles. For a moment, we were still. No talking, no scrolling, no stress. Just the whisper of wind and the silence of a forest holding its breath. If I had known what would happen next, I would have clung to that moment a little longer, because none of us realized that the woods were already watching. We must have been resting there for 15, maybe 20 minutes, just long enough for our bodies to cool and our muscles to start tightening, when Dave stood up, dusted off his jeans and said he was going to take a leak. He wandered off toward a patch of trees just beyond the clearing, waving vaguely over his shoulder, and none of us thought anything of it. We were too focused on stretching, drinking water, and pulling energy bars out of crinkly wrappers. The air was warm, the sky clear, and we were so deep in relaxation that it barely registered how still the forest had become. I remember sipping from my water bottle and hearing nothing but the leaves shifting high above. No birdsong, no wind, just quiet. That kind of quiet you don't notice until it ends, violently. The scream that came next shattered everything. It was raw, primal. The kind of scream that doesn't sound human, even though it clearly is. There was no mistaking the voice Dave, but it didn't sound like a reaction to something minor. It wasn't just pain or surprise. It was terror. That scream didn't come from someone who stubbed a toe or tripped on a root. It came from something deeper, something that had yanked all rational thought from his mind and left only panic behind. We jumped to our feet instantly, instinct taking over before words even formed. Rob shouted something, but I didn't hear it over the pounding in my ears. We ran, crashing through brush and branches, tearing through the trees in the direction Dave had gone. It didn't take long to find him, maybe 30 yards from the clearing. Half hidden behind a crooked pine, Dave lay crumpled on the ground, his face white with pain, sweat glistening on his forehead. But it was his leg that stopped us cold. A rusted bear trap had clamped down just above his ankle, the jagged teeth sunk deep into his flesh. His hands were clawing at the metal, trying to pry it off, but it was no use. The thing looked ancient, solid, iron caked in dirt and rust. Blood pooled beneath his leg, soaking into the pine needles and blackening the soil. I could barely look at it. My stomach turned over on itself as I caught a glimpse of bone beneath torn skin. Jenna dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she hovered uselessly, whispering, oh God," over and over. Rob swore and started pacing, and Jay just stood frozen, like his brain had hit a wall. For a split second, we were paralyzed, not by inaction, but by the sheer wrongness of it. How was something like this even out here? Who would leave a trap like that in a public forest? But we had no time to think. Dave was screaming again, and all we could do was try to help. Even though none of us had any idea how, Jay was the first to snap out of it. He dropped to his knees beside Dave and muttered, "I've seen this kind before. Old traps like this usually have a release lever." His voice was low but urgent, shaking almost as much as his hands as he began to feel along the trap's rusted frame. The sound of Dave's wheezing breaths filled the clearing, short and sharp like he was gasping between sobs. I dropped down beside them to help, while Jenna just kept gripping Dave's hand like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. Rob hovered close, eyes darting through the trees like he was expecting something worse to follow. My stomach was still twisted in knots, but I forced myself to look at the trap. It was brutal, jagged metal, dirt-caked and corroded, the kind of thing that looked like it had been buried there for decades, waiting like a hidden mouth. Finally, Jay found it, a lever half buried in the soil, crusted with grime and nearly fused shut. "Hold him," he said, and we nodded without thinking. Rob and I pinned Dave's shoulders down as he began to thrash, instinctively trying to escape the pain. Jenna leaned over him, whispering calming things I don't think he could even hear. Then Jay pushed hard down on the lever. It resisted, groaned with the strain of years, then snapped open with a metallic scream. The jaws sprang apart, and Dave let out a howl I'll never forget, one that rose from his gut and echoed through the trees. But what we saw when the trap came loose was far worse. The flesh around Dave's ankle had been mangled beyond recognition. Torn muscle, peeled. Skin and the edge of shattered bone were exposed beneath blood-slicked strands of tissue. The bandages Jenna wrapped around his leg soaked red instantly. Dave had gone limp by then, eyes fluttering as his body finally gave out from the pain. We had to get him out. Now. The idea of camping was out of the question. We left most of our gear behind, grabbed only what we needed, and started hauling him back toward the car. Jay and I supported his weight, his arms slung over our shoulders, while Jenna kept a hand on his back, murmuring soft encouragements. Rob took the lead, his face pale, his hand gripping a pistol he'd brought just in case. None of us had questioned why he'd packed it before. Now it felt like the only sensible thing we'd done. But the forest wasn't the same anymore. The quiet had turned sinister, every snapped twig sounding like a threat. The serenity from earlier was gone, replaced with a suffocating sense of dread that seemed to hang from the branches. Dave's blood left a dotted trail behind us, bright red against the earth, and we could hear it drip in rhythm with his ragged breathing. We were making decent progress, driven by fear and adrenaline, and I think we started to believe we could make it, until the gunshot. It cracked through the air like lightning, a high, sharp sound that sliced through our concentration. I felt The breeze of it passed near my face, close enough that my instinct was to duck and drag Dave down with me behind a fallen log. Another shot rang out, and this one shattered bark right above our heads. What the hell? Rob shouted, returning fire blindly into the trees while yelling at us to move. We were being hunted. We didn't know by who. We didn't know why. All we knew was that someone was shooting at us in the middle of nowhere, and we were too exposed to fight back. Jay and I struggled to lift Dave again as he groaned in pain, his blood smearing against our clothes, our hands slipping slightly under the weight. Jenna followed close behind, and Rob kept firing, eyes darting wildly as he tried to hold the line. More shots echoed, some close, some far, but the sound bounced off the trees so wildly that we couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore. It was chaos, pure disorienting chaos. Branches whipped our faces, roots nearly tripped us, and Dave was barely conscious now. Still, he pushed forward, hobbling like a man possessed, using what little strength he had left. Rob caught up and shouted, "Keep going," as he reloaded, and I didn't dare stop. We were running on fumes, lungs on fire, legs screaming in protest. But there, through the thinning trees, we saw it, the faint outline of the trailhead. The car, we just had to make it a few more steps. We didn't stop to check if the shooting had ended. We didn't look back. We just ran, dragging Dave, gasping, soaked in blood and sweat, until the car was within reach, shining like salvation through the trees. We threw the doors open and practically shoved Dave into the back seat, his blood smearing across the cushions and pooling beneath. Jenna climbed in with him, hands fumbling for clean bandages from the first aid kit. Jay jumped behind the wheel. Rob stood outside the passenger door for a second longer than the rest of us, pistol still raised, eyes scanning the tree line like he expected a shadow to step forward and finish what had been started. I grabbed his arm and pulled him in, slamming. The door shut behind us as Jay turned the key. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out of that trailhead like the road was on fire. The drive was a blur of winding turns and bouncing shocks. Dave groaned in the back, sometimes muttering nonsense, sometimes falling silent in a way that made our hearts jump until he stirred again. Jenna never stopped talking to him, coaxing, begging, whispering things like, "You're okay. We're almost there, stay with me." Her voice cracked more than once, but she kept going. The blood had soaked through all the bandages by then, and none of us were sure if he was going to make it. My phone had no signal. None of ours did, so we didn't stop until we reached a small town nearly 30 miles away. We skidded into the emergency entrance, the tires screeching against the pavement. Nurses and doctors rushed out as soon as they saw us, bloodied, panicked, half delirious. They got Dave out on a stretcher and wheeled him into surgery without a second wasted. And just like that, we were left standing there in the waiting room, shaking, filthy, our clothes soaked in blood and dirt and fear. None of us spoke at first. We just sat, for hours, long after the adrenaline wore off and the exhaustion set in like cement. Eventually, a doctor came out and told us that Dave was stable. He wasn't going to die, but his leg was a mess. The damage was extensive, and though they'd managed to save it, there were no guarantees he'd ever walk the same again. After the relief settled, the questions started. The police came and took our statements. 2 uniformed officers with notepads and blank stares. We told them everything, the scream, the trap, the shooting. They asked if we'd seen the shooter. We hadn't. We hadn't interacted with anyone on the trail. There were no fights, no arguments, no one else around for miles. And the trap? They barely raised an eyebrow. Said old traps sometimes get left behind. Said they'd look into it. Their tone said otherwise. Dave's parents called them repeatedly for weeks, pushing for updates, but nothing ever came. The investigation went nowhere. The shooter was never identified. The forest never gave up its secrets. The stuff we'd left behind is still out there. Our tents, our packs, our food, like artifacts from a day we all wish we could erase. Dave recovered in time, mostly. He walks with a limp now, and the scar is gruesome, but you wouldn't know how close he came to losing his leg just by looking at him. We've tried to talk about it a few times, usually over drinks when the room is quiet and the memories creep in. But the words don't come easily. There's always this silence, heavy and uncertain, that hangs between us, and sometimes late at night when I'm alone and the house is too quiet, I still hear that scream. The one that shattered the forest, the one that changed everything. We survived, but something about us didn't come back whole. Something stayed in those woods, watching, waiting. Story 2. The Fugitive at Oola Peak. It was late October of 1986, a cold Sunday night in Spokane, and I was halfway through a bowl of chili and a football highlight reel when the phone rang. No one ever called after 10 p.m. unless it was important, and I knew before I even picked it up that it was work. Be at the federal courthouse at 8 a.m. sharp, my supervisory deputy told me. You've got a task force briefing. That was it. No name, no details, just that tone in his voice that said this was big. I'd been a U.S. Marshal out of the Eastern Washington District for about 4 years by then, long enough to recognize the shape of something serious when it started rolling in. Task force meant coordination, jurisdiction overlap, and more often than not, danger. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I showed up at the Spokane County Courthouse, early, coffee in hand, and found a room already packed with bodies, marshals from both our office and Seattle, a couple of FBI agents I recognized, 2 state troopers, and a pair of Spokane PD detectives. The air was thick with caffeine and tension. Everyone was waiting for the chief to speak. When he finally stepped up to the front of the room, he didn't waste time. We've got a priority fugitive, Raymond Ridgway, 42, red hair, lean, burn scars on his palms, multiple tattoos, 4 counts of homicide across Idaho and Oregon, and the ambush killing of 2 FBI agents last year. The room went still. I remember the look on everyone's face shifting from alert to haunted. He's dangerous, unstable but intelligent, and we believe he's dug into the Patan wilderness, somewhere near Oola Peak. They pulled out a map next, projected it against the wall, a ridgeline circled in red. Steep terrain, high elevation, early snowfall already setting in. We'd be staging out of Winthrop and moving in on foot. No air transport, no backup once we were in. It would take us the better part of a day to hike up, and that's if the weather held. They briefed us on the layout, Alpha team up the summit, Bravo flanking, Charlie holding the perimeter. Ridgway was to be apprehended or neutralized. Dead or alive, the chief said flatly. I've been in a lot of operations, but nothing about this felt normal. Even before we left, something already felt off. At first light the next morning, our convoy rolled out of Winthrop, black SUVs and trooper trucks crunching over wet gravel, headlights cutting through the lingering mountain mist. The air was razor sharp, the kind of cold that seeps through every layer of your gear. We followed Highway 20 for an hour, before turning onto a narrowing Forest Service road, climbing steadily until it finally gave way to a dirt clearing marked by a rusted sign. Nothing more than a trailhead and a promise. Oola Peak loomed in the distance, its jagged outline streaked with fresh snow, partly shrouded in low-hanging clouds. We reviewed the plan one last time before splitting into teams, radios crackling to life as we double-checked our gear and began the long hike upward. The trail started flat, winding through thick timber where frost clung to the underbrush, but as we climbed it grew steeper, the cold more biting. The tree cover thinned gradually, and the ground beneath our boots turned slick with frozen mud and loose shale. By midday our legs were burning and our breath was coming in fogged bursts, but we pushed forward, heads down, weapons ready, eyes scanning every shadow. That's when one of my guys, Torres, stopped short and pointed toward the ground at AS. First I didn't get it, just a dead bird lying limp in the snow. Then I saw another one and another, a squirrel, a marmot, then more, scattered across the slope like discarded leaves, small bodies frozen mid-motion, untouched by blood or wounds. The forest floor was littered with them, dozens at least, and none showed signs of decay or predation. It was like they'd just fallen out of the sky. I pulled my radio and checked in with Bravo team. You seeing anything strange? A beat of static, then their lead responded, voice tight. Affirmative. East flank has the same thing. Birds, squirrels, even a fox, all dead, no trauma, no clue. I looked at Torres and saw the same unease I felt settling into his features. Orders from command? I asked. Bravo confirmed they'd flagged it to Charlie, but the directive remained the same. Keep moving. Ridgeway was the priority. No one wanted to stop for dead animals. So we kept climbing, stepping over little frozen corpses as we went. The higher we got, the quieter everything became. No wind, no birdsong, just the crunch of boots in snow and the sound of our own breathing. The air had a sour edge to it, metallic and stale, like something was wrong with the mountain itself. I told myself it was just altitude or nerves, but deep down, I didn't believe that. When we crested the last ridge, the summit shelf finally came into view. A flat ledge of snow-covered rock just a few hundred meters below the peak, and tucked against the base of a cliff was the cave. It wasn't deep from the outside, more like a jagged cut into the mountain, partially hidden by a slanted slab of granite. The most likely place Ridgeway would be hiding, and according to intel, the only real shelter on that face. As Alpha, we took point. The rest of the teams looped around to close the perimeter. We spread out, weapons raised, boots crunching over frost and dead things. And as we neared the mouth of that cave, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not just nerves. Something deeper. Something instinctual. The kind of dread you feel before a storm breaks, or just before something reaches out from the dark. The closer we got to the cave, the more surreal everything became. The air felt denser somehow, like it pressed against our skin, humming just beneath the surface of audibility. I motioned for the team to fan out, rifles raised, eyes sweeping, every inch of the jagged stone around the entrance. Charlie team came in from the east, their boots crunching across the frozen slope, and their leader gave me a sharp nod. Bravo would be close behind, closing the net. We moved in silence. No, one spoke, not even over the radio. It was the kind of quiet that carried weight, the kind that made you hold your breath without realizing. I stepped forward, flicked on my flashlight, and aimed it into the cave. The beam cut through the darkness, dancing off rough stone walls, and settling into a narrow chamber maybe 30 feet deep. The air that flowed out was cold and damp, laced with that same faint metallic sourness we'd picked up on the slope. I stepped in first, then Torres and another deputy behind me, our lights overlapping in a sweeping arc. About 10 paces in, we saw him. Raymond Ridgeway sat at the far end of the cave, his back to us, legs crossed beneath him, rocking slowly back and forth. His head was bowed, red hair matted and tangled, shoulders hunched like he'd been sitting there for days. He didn't turn when my voice rang out, steady and loud. Raymond Ridgeway, U.S. Marshals, lay down with your hands behind your back. Nothing, no reaction. He just kept rocking, slow and hypnotic, as if the world outside didn't exist. Charlie's team joined us, lights crisscrossing, commands doubling up, growing louder. Down, face down, hands behind your back. But Ridgeway remained locked in that eerie rhythm, completely unbothered. The hairs on my neck prickled. Something was wrong, not just with his stillness, but with the whole atmosphere inside the cave. The light from our flashlights cast his elongated shadow against the wall, and the cave seemed to narrow around us like it was breathing. Torres took a step forward, letting his rifle hang from its sling. "Let's go," he muttered, reaching out toward Ridgway's shoulder. The second he touched him, everything changed. Torres's body convulsed violently, as if he'd been electrocuted. He gasped, eyes flying open in pure terror, and then dropped to the ground in a boneless heap, limbs twitching, foam bubbling at the edge of his mouth. It happened so fast we didn't even process it. My training screamed at me to secure the suspect, but my instincts were louder. Back up, now. But even before I could act, Ridgway jerked like a puppet whose strings had just been yanked. His head snapped up, his neck twisting at a harsh angle, and he finally looked at us. His eyes were wide, unfocused, flicking between us as if he didn't know where he was. Then he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man about to surrender, or even a madman relishing chaos. It was a calm, unsettling grin, a mask of some silent understanding that none of us shared. I barked another command, voice harder this time. "Hands behind your back, now!" And this time he obeyed, still smiling. We moved in fast, zip-tying his wrists, dragging him up to his feet. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just rocked, slightly on his heels like he was still somewhere else entirely. Behind us, Charlie's medic had dropped to his knees beside Torres. The deputy was unconscious, breathing shallow and fast, skin pale and slick with sweat. "It looks like a seizure," the medic said, checking vitals. "But I don't like how shallow he's breathing. We need evac now." I radioed command, voice low and clipped, requesting emergency airlift. They rerouted the chopper immediately. Ridgway stood with his head tilted slightly, staring blankly at nothing, his smile finally fading into an empty gaze. When the helicopter arrived, we loaded Torres first, still unresponsive, and then Ridgway, strapped down and silent. As the blades whirred and lifted them out of the snow-covered shelf, I turned back to look at the cave. Dark, narrow, unassuming, and for a moment I had the irrational feeling that it had been watching us all along. We regrouped, silent and shaken. There were no shots fired, no resistance, and yet it felt like something had gone terribly wrong. We got Ridgway, but Torres was down. The forest around us, once just wilderness, now felt infected. No one said it aloud, but we all felt it. Whatever Ridgway had brought with him into that cave, it hadn't stayed behind. Back at base in Winthrop, we were quiet. Not the usual kind of exhausted silence that follows a high-stakes mission. This was heavier, like something was sitting on our chests. The debrief felt hollow. Ridgway was in custody, pending trial. Torres was unconscious, flown to a hospital in Spokane, where they placed him in a medically induced coma to control the seizures. Doctors weren't optimistic at first, and when he finally woke up a week later, he couldn't remember a thing. Not the cave, not the climb, not even the days leading up to the raid. It was like something had wiped his memory clean. Fisia, reports were filed. Ridgway was processed, but he never said a word. He just sat in his cell, rocking slowly, just like in the cave. Same posture, same rhythm, same empty gaze. When the incident reports were reviewed, the dead animals barely got a mention. Just one throwaway line. Numerous deceased wildlife. Observed near suspect's location, likely killed for food. That was it. No autopsies, no toxicology, no testing. No one bothered to ask why there were dozens of small animals dead with no visible injuries, scattered in every direction, like they'd simply dropped. As for Torres, the medical file labeled his episode a spontaneous neurological event, likely stress-induced, maybe a hidden seizure disorder. Coincidence, they called it, nothing more. But I couldn't stop thinking about that cave, the stench, the stillness, the way Ridgway never reacted until Torres touched him. I played it all over in my head, again and again, trying to make it fit into something rational. It never did. The agency moved on. Ridgway's case progressed through the system, and the oddities were buried in paperwork no one would ever really read. But I couldn't let it go. That moment, Torres hitting the ground like a marionette with its strings cut, haunted me more than the shootouts, more than the chases, because this wasn't just violence, it was something else, something wrong. And in the end, the part that still sticks with me isn't Ridgway's crimes or the raid itself. It's how quickly the strangest parts were dismissed, erased, pushed aside. Like the agencies weren't just protecting us from people like Ridgway. They were protecting us from truths we weren't meant to understand. Story 3. Forestry Tech in the Tongass. My name's Cal, and I've been working as a forestry technician in the Tongass National Forest up in Alaska for the past 6 years. It's the kind of job most people don't think about until they're deep in the woods and wondering who maintains the trails or checks the health of the trees. But for me, it was a calling. I grew up in northern Minnesota, where the woods were right outside my back door. My dad was a logger, and from the time I could walk, he had me tagging along on hikes, fishing trips, and long afternoons wandering beneath the canopies. I learned early how to read tree bark, how to listen to wind patterns, how to spot the signs of rot or blight. I liked the solitude of it, the kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. After high school, I bounced between a few dead-end jobs before enrolling in community college for a degree in natural resources. That eventually led me to a seasonal position with the Forest Service back home, and later, a recommendation for an opening in Alaska. I didn't hesitate. 5 days of driving through Canada and a float plane ride later, I found myself dropped into the Tongass. I remember the first time I saw it from above. Endless miles of mountains and temperate rainforest, dense and mysterious and vast. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. I signed on full-time after my first season. My cabin's small and off-grid, nothing fancy. Just a single room with a wood stove and a cot, perched not far from the ranger station. It's all I need. I spend most days checking timber stands, marking trees for potential harvest, running soil samples and hiking trails so remote they don't even appear on most maps. It's hard, physical work, and the weather's brutal. Rain more often than not, cold that sinks through your bones. But I love it. Or at least I used to, before what happened. Before the thing I still can't explain. Out here I've been stalked by bears, nearly buried in landslides, and caught in blizzards miles from shelter. But nothing, not one thing has ever scared me like what I heard that day by the creek. And the worst part? I never even saw it. It was late August, and I was deep in one of the more rugged stretches of the Tongass, 12 miles north of the station, up in a sector of old-growth forest that hadn't seen any real human activity in years. The trees up there stretch skyward like cathedral pillars, and the moss is so thick it muffles your footsteps, like the forest wants to swallow the sound. I'd been out since before sunrise, running soil samples, marking trees for inspection, and hiking in slow loops along a half-forgotten ridge. By mid-afternoon I was exhausted. My boots were soaked, my shoulders ached from the pack, and the sky was beginning to dim just slightly, in that way it does when summer starts to slip toward fall. I headed toward a little creek I'd used before, a quiet spot tucked behind a rise where the water ran shallow and cold. The idea was simple. Rest for a bit, eat something, rinse the mud off my gear, then head back toward base before the light got low. Just another end to just another day. I sat on a fallen log beside the stream, unwrapped my sandwich and leaned back, letting the ambient hum of the forest settle around me. The wind stirred the leaves, water burbled softly over stone, and for a few blissful minutes I was the only person in the world. Then came the sound, At first it was subtle, like a branch breaking somewhere uphill. Then another, heavier, rhythmic. Snap, thud, pause, snap, thud. My body went still. That wasn't the skittering of a squirrel or the scatter of a bear through brush. It was something larger, deliberate. I've heard moose crash through underbrush before. This wasn't that. Whatever it was moving with purpose, not panic. I froze, listening harder. The sound was maybe 50 yards away and closing, slowly. Something big, heavy, upright. It was the kind of realization that doesn't hit all at once, but creeps in and turns your guts cold. I stood up, grabbed my bear spray and called out, loud, clear, and practiced. "Hey, you didn't smell me yet, Mama Bear," I waited. No grunt, no movement away. If anything, it got louder, closer. I could feel it in my chest, like the rhythm of the thing matched my heartbeat in reverse. Snap, thud, snap, thud. That's when the smell hit me. It wasn't animal, it wasn't decay, it was sharp, acidic, almost metallic, like the tang of copper mixed with sweat and ozone. It clung to the back of my throat and made my eyes water. I gagged reflexively, one hand bracing against the log. My brain was screaming to leave, but something in my body didn't want to turn its back. It felt like being watched. Not just watched, noticed. I shouted again, this time louder. "Get the hell out of here!" Still nothing. No sound of retreat. No crashing flight. Whatever was out there didn't care that I was yelling. That more than anything scared the hell out of me. Wild animals react. Fight, flight, something. This didn't. It was just moving, steady, confident. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line, trying to spot movement. Nothing. Just that relentless rhythm and the overwhelming stench rolling downhill on the breeze. I turned and ran. I'm not proud of it, but it was instinct. I bolted down the trail like something was right behind me, crashing through ferns and low-hanging branches, my boots slamming the earth, breath ragged in my chest. The panic wasn't just fear, it was wrongness, the kind that gets in your teeth and under your skin. I ran until the sound faded, until the pounding in my chest drowned out everything else. Only then did I stop, hunched over, gasping, surrounded by silence. And in that silence, a deeper fear bloomed. Because even though the sound had vanished, I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't imagined it. Something had been there. Something that walked like a man, moved like it owned the forest, and made no effort to hide. I hadn't seen it, but I had felt it. Felt the pressure of its presence like a weight in the air. And the worst part, I wasn't sure it had ever really left. By the time I made it back to the trail junction, the forest had gone quiet again, but not in the normal way. The usual sounds of birds fluttering, branches creaking, or squirrels darting through the underbrush had vanished, as if the entire area was holding its breath. I stood there for a moment, listening with every fiber of my being, straining to catch even the smallest sound behind me, but there was nothing. Just the thud of my own pulse echoing in my ears, and the memory of that unnatural rhythm chasing me like a ghost. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped the bear spray. I remember trying to slow my breathing, telling myself that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that I was just dehydrated, maybe overtired. But even then I didn't believe it. The smell still lingered faintly in my nostrils, metallic, sour, like rusted iron baking in the sun. I'd encountered bears, moose, even a lynx once, but never anything that made me feel like I'd trespassed on something I wasn't meant to witness. I kept moving, fast but cautious, checking over my shoulder every few steps, convinced I'd see something between the trees. But the woods offered nothing, no glimpse of fur, no silhouette in the branches. Still, the sense of being watched never left me. It clung to my spine like static electricity, humming just out of reach. The closer I got to the ranger station, the more I began to wonder if I was losing it. Rational thoughts started to reassert themselves. Maybe it was a moose with a limp. Maybe there was a dead animal somewhere upwind causing the stench. Maybe I just needed to sleep. But that night, alone in my cabin, every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside had me snapping upright in bed. I barely slept. I lay there with the lights on, eyes fixed on the door, listening. Just listening. And that scent, God, that scent, seemed to return every time I thought I'd shaken it. Not strong, just enough to make my stomach twist. The next morning I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee and watched the trees. The mist rolled in like it always did, soft and silent, but I wasn't comforted. Something had changed. I couldn't explain it, couldn't prove it, but I felt it in my bones. Later that week I mentioned it to Jim, one of the older forestry techs. He'd been out here decades longer than I had, the kind of guy who'd seen just about everything the forest had to offer. We were splitting wood behind the station, and I casually told him, "I think I heard something up north. Something big. Didn't sound like any bear I've heard." Jim paused mid-swing, then looked at me with an expression I didn't expect, something between sympathy and concern. "You sure you weren't just overworked?" he asked. "That place up there's got a way of playing tricks on you if you're tired." I nodded, pretended to laugh it off, but he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye for the rest of the day. Like he was waiting for something else to spill out, or maybe like he already knew what I wasn't saying. And that, more than anything, was what chilled me. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest since. I stick to the trails closer, to the station now, areas I know well, places where I can see the tree line in all directions. I still do the job, still lace up my boots and head into the woods most mornings, clipboard in hand, radio on my vest. But something's different. I'm different. I catch myself pausing more often, ears straining at the wind, eyes flicking toward shadows that don't move. The woods were once a sanctuary to me, full of mystery, sure, but always within the bounds of nature. Now there's a crack in that belief. Something slipped through, something that doesn't belong. I never saw it, never heard its voice or caught its shape, but it changed me all the same. There are nights when I wake up convinced that I've heard that same rhythmic thud just outside my window, or that the metallic scent is seeping in through the walls of the cabin again. I tell myself it's just imagination, but it never really leaves. I haven't told anyone else, not the rangers, not the supervisors, not my family back in Minnesota, and definitely not anyone new to the job. There's no real way to explain it without sounding unhinged. How do you tell someone that you were followed by a presence you couldn't see, couldn't understand, but knew was real? I've stopped trying to figure it out. There's no logic to it, just instinct and dread and the kind of silence that sinks its teeth in. I still walk the forest, I still respect it, but I don't trust it anymore. Whatever was out there that day, it let me leave. And I pray every day that it never decides to come looking again. Story 4. The Deer in the Tree. It was the late summer of 1992 when I convinced my girlfriend Sarah to come on a day hike with me through a stretch of wilderness near Mount Rainier. We'd been dating for about a year, and while she wasn't what you'd call outdoorsy, she humored my love of nature with quiet patience. She'd grown up in the city, bright lights, sidewalks, sirens. I grew up on trail maps and Forest Service cabins. The plan was simple: a 6 or 7 mile round trip along a loop I'd read about in a guidebook. The trail wasn't especially steep or remote, just thick with trees and undergrowth, a classic Pacific Northwest setting. We left early that morning just after sunrise, with water bottles, sandwiches, and a printed map in my back pocket. No phones back then, no GPS, just compass, daylight and instinct. At first it was perfect. The air was cool and dry, the kind of mountain air that wakes you up better than any coffee. Shafts of sunlight cut through the towering pines and cedars, dappling the path with gold. Sarah was quiet, but I could tell she was enjoying it more than she let on. The trail wound gently through the woods, crossing a shallow creek at one point, and I reached out to steady her as she stepped on the slick stones. She laughed when she nearly slipped, a small nervous laugh, but it was the first time I saw her relax. We stopped for lunch on a fallen log about 3 hours in, not far from where the trail began to loop back around. Sarah looked a little tired, but she never complained. I remember thinking how proud I was of her, of how she'd taken this strange, wild place in stride. After eating, we continued walking uphill along a gentle incline where the forest opened up a bit. Less canopy, more underbrush. That's when she started falling a few paces behind me. I slowed for her, thinking she just needed a break. And then she stopped completely. I turned around to tease her about quitting early, but the look on her face made the words die in my throat. She was staring into the woods with wide, unmoving eyes, and whatever she was looking at had stolen every last trace of sunlight from the day. At first I thought Sarah was staring at a bear. Her body had gone stiff, her mouth slightly open, and she wasn't blinking. I followed her gaze into the trees, scanning for movement, trying to brace myself for the sight of fur or antlers. But there was no animal, at least not in the way I expected. What I saw made my breath catch. About 20 feet off the trail there was a massive tree, probably 3 feet thick, and halfway up its trunk was a deer. Not next to it, not leaning against it, inside it. The body of a full-grown buck was somehow embedded in the trunk, bisected cleanly through the middle, its front half sticking out one side, limp and lifeless, the head tilted down with glassy eyes while the hind legs hung motionless out the other side. It wasn't slumped across a forked branch or caught in vines. It was as if the tree had grown around it. I stepped toward it before I realized I was even moving. Sarah hissed my name, her hand grabbing my arm with white-knuckled intensity. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it got caught in a split trunk somehow, and the tree grew to close around it over time. But that didn't make sense. The deer looked fresh, not bloated or skeletal. A few flies buzzed lazily near its eyes, but there was no rot, no odor, no blood. The bark around the body wasn't torn or damaged. It was smooth, untouched, flowing, naturally around the deer's form like clay. I crouched down to get a closer look. The roots around the base of the tree were thick, unbroken, the ground undisturbed. Nothing suggested that this was an act of violence or decay. It just was. Stood up and walked around to the other side. Same thing. Smooth bark, hind legs hanging like someone had staged it. I didn't know whether to be amazed or terrified, but then the air around us changed. The forest, which had been full of birdsong and the distant murmur of wind in the branches, suddenly went mute. Not a single chirp, not a rustle, just silence. An unnatural silence like sound itself had been sucked out of the woods. My skin prickled, and for the first time I felt something I hadn't in all my years of hiking: wrongness. I turned to look at Sarah. Her eyes were still locked on the deer, but her whole body had drawn in on itself. "We need to go," she said, her voice small and firm. I should have listened to her immediately, but I couldn't stop staring. I'd seen predator kills, carcasses caught in barbed wire, even animals struck by lightning once, but nothing like this. It felt staged, like a message left behind in a language I didn't understand. The longer I looked, the more I felt like we'd stumbled into something we weren't meant to see. Not just out of place, but out of possibility. Then I heard it. Or rather, I realized I didn't hear anything. No birds, no leaves, no water, just my breathing and Sarah's. The forest had gone still, not calm but expectant, watching, waiting. And suddenly, I couldn't bear to look at the deer any longer. I turned away, heart racing, skin clammy, and nodded. "Okay," I said. "Let's go." We didn't run, but we moved fast, quieter than before, more cautious. And even though we didn't speak another word until we reached the trailhead, I knew we both felt it. Something had changed in the woods. Something had seen us, and it hadn't moved. We moved quickly, but without running, our footsteps oddly loud in the silence, each crunch of gravel or brush like it didn't belong in the world we'd just entered. I kept expecting the forest to snap back into place, to hear a bird, a squirrel, anything, but it didn't. The quiet trailed us like a second shadow, and no matter how much distance we put between ourselves and that impossible tree, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still too close. I glanced at Sarah a few times as we hiked. She kept her eyes fixed on the trail, arms crossed tightly across her chest like she was holding herself together. Her face had gone pale, lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. I didn't speak. Neither did she. Words felt like the wrong tool for what we'd seen. The deeper we went into the descent, the more my thoughts started spiraling. How could something like that exist? A tree doesn't absorb a deer whole in months, let alone days. Trees don't do that. Nature doesn't do that, unless something made it, or put it there. And that idea, that it wasn't just some freak accident, but something intentional, gnawed at me harder than anything. By the time we reached the lower trailhead, the sun was already starting to drop. The warmth was gone from the air, replaced with a damp chill that clung to my skin. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing just off the path, watching us. I never did, but the sensation didn't leave. It was like the forest had eyes and they didn't blink. We reached the car in near silence. Sarah got in without a word, staring out the window as I threw our gear into the back and started the engine. The moment the doors were shut, the forest became a memory behind glass, but I still couldn't breathe right. The tension hadn't left, it had followed us in. During the drive, neither of us spoke. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, and every curve of the road felt like a tightrope. When we pulled into her driveway, she finally turned to me and said, "We're not talking about this again, ever." I nodded. I understood. There was nothing to say, no logical unpacking that would make the image of that deer in the tree any less surreal, any less wrong. There are things that don't want to be seen, places you pass through only once. This had been one of them. Even now, years later, that tree burns in my mind. The shape of the deer, the impossible smoothness of the bark where its body emerged, the way the forest fell silent like it knew something we didn't. It's not just a memory, it's a wound, one I can't scrub clean, no matter how many times I hike a new trail or sit beside a calm stream. Nature has rules, cycles, patterns, but that tree didn't follow any of them. It was like a scar in the world, something ancient and watching, and we had walked right up to it like children wandering into a locked room. And even though we left, I don't think we really came back whole. We never spoke about it again. Not once, not even in passing. It was like we'd signed some unspoken pact the moment we left that trail behind, that what we saw belonged to the forest now, and dragging it into the light would only make it worse. Sarah and I broke up a few months later, not because of what happened, at least not directly, but something between us had cracked that day. Something subtle but irreversible. There was a distance neither of us could cross after that, a quiet tension. I think we both knew we were carrying the same image in our minds, but were too afraid to acknowledge it, even to each other. And in truth, I didn't want to speak it aloud. Saying it would mean admitting it had been real. That it wasn't just some bizarre visual trick or dreamlike lapse in reason, but a moment where the natural order of the world had failed in front of us, and we were powerless to explain it. I still hike, but never anywhere near that trail. I've tried to find the spot on maps, but it's like the area doesn't exist in any official record. I don't even remember which trailhead we used anymore, just vague shapes of ridgelines and the echo of silence that fell when the birds stopped singing. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, the image of that deer comes back, not gory or grotesque, but quiet and wrong. I'll picture the tree, the smooth bark, the way the animal's lifeless body jutted from the trunk, like it had grown there, like it belonged. And with it comes that same cold sensation in my spine, that understanding that there are things in this world, hidden pockets of unreality, where the rules break, where meaning frays, and where we don't belong. We were lucky, I think. Whatever that was, it let us walk away, but it didn't let us forget. I've never told anyone else, not because I don't want to, but because I'm not sure how. It's not a story you share. It's something you carry, quietly, forever. Story 5. The Beetle in the Everglades. Last summer, I took a solo trip into the MSD wilderness down in Florida, deep Everglades country, the kind of place where the trees crowd the sky and the humidity hangs like a wet cloth over everything. It wasn't my first time out there. I've done dozens of solo hikes over the years, all over the US, the Rockies, the Pacific Northwest, even parts of Alaska, but the Everglades had a different energy. Something about the stillness, the wet breath of the forest, the way the land feels more alive than anywhere else. It buzzes constantly, even when it's quiet. That trip was supposed to be my reset. A few days unplugged, no signal, no noise, just me and the trail. I'd been under a lot of stress with work and wanted the kind of peace only a solo hike could bring. I parked at a half-forgotten ranger gate on the edge of the preserve and set off with nothing but a hammock, my pack, and a looped trail marked on a crumpled map. I planned to hike in about 6 miles, make camp for a night or two, and then circle back through a different trail. The day started off normally. The sun was high, the air thick, and I could hear the familiar din of life all around. Cicadas, buzzing, birds calling, frogs croaking from hidden pools. I moved at a good pace, swatting at mosquitoes and breathing in the sharp green scent of swamp life. I was about 4 hours in when I stopped to rest beneath a mangrove tree that arched over the path like a canopy. The breeze was barely enough to keep the sweat off my back, and I pulled out a bottle of water and some jerky, just enjoying the sense of isolation. That's always been my favorite part, being truly alone, no conversations, no cars, no obligation. But looking back, I remember that moment a little too clearly now. Not because it was peaceful, but because it was the last time the world felt normal. After that, things shifted. It didn't happen all at once, but there was a change in the air, a subtle vibration that started in the distance and crept closer, like something ancient had begun to stir. It started as a low hum, distant, constant, and mechanical sounding, like the thrum of a lawnmower or the idle of an old engine far off through the trees. At first I thought nothing of it. Noise travels weird out in the Everglades. I'd heard airboats miles away before, their sound bouncing off the swamp like a phantom. But this wasn't that. There was no chop, no rhythm to suggest blades or machinery. It was smoother, deeper, and oddly steady. I paused mid-chew, listening more carefully, and realized the sound wasn't drifting toward me. It was building, getting louder, closer. The vibrations settled into my chest like bass from a concert speaker, subtle, then growing. That's when I realized I wasn't hearing it as much as I was feeling it, a droning pressure that crawled into my sternum and made my shoulders tense without knowing why. I stood up slowly, scanned the treetops and the clearing around me, but there was nothing. Just swamp, just green, just that ever-thickening buzz. Then it broke the tree line. At first I thought it was a bird, some massive swamp crane or vulture, but the shape was wrong. Too compact, too dark, and it moved like no bird I've ever seen. This thing hovered, just above the mangroves. When it banked into view, the sun caught the sheen of its shell, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a beetle, or something like a beetle, but it was huge, as big as a football, maybe bigger, and its body gleamed a wet, iridescent green-black, like oil on water. Its legs dangled beneath it, hooked and twitching in the air, as its wings moved so fast they blurred into invisibility. The sound was coming from it, that same low-frequency buzz, now oppressive and right on top of me. I didn't move, couldn't move. My brain was still trying to process how something that big could fly, let alone exist. Then it turned toward me. It didn't just float around randomly. It turned, looked at me. I know how that sounds. Bugs don't look at you. But this thing had eyes, huge and black and glossy like marbles dipped in ink, and they locked onto mine with an awareness that was wrong. Not reactive, not instinctual. Intentional. I felt pinned by them, like it had already decided I didn't belong there. Even though I'd faced bears, snakes, and worse in years of hiking, none of them had ever made me feel like prey the way this thing did. My skin went ice cold, despite the swamp heat pressing down on me like a blanket. The air was so thick it felt hard to breathe, and I could feel sweat rolling down my spine, tickling with every motionless second. My legs finally got the message, before the rest of me did, and I staggered back a step, never breaking eye contact. That was all it took. With a flick of its wings, it shot upward into the canopy, vanishing between the branches like it had never been there. The hum dropped instantly, like someone had thrown a switch. Silence returned, not peaceful, but stunned. I stood alone again, in the clearing, chest heaving, pulse jackhammering against my ribs. I don't know how long I stood there before I moved again, but when I did, I moved fast. My pack hit my shoulders with a slap, and I started back down the trail in the direction I'd come. I told myself it was just a beetle, some oversized swamp bug that hadn't been catalogued yet. But the lie didn't stick. Not with those eyes, burned into my memory. Not with that sound still rumbling in my chest like an echo of something unnatural, something that wasn't supposed to see me, let alone recognize me. I didn't stop moving for miles. Every sound in the forest became suspect. The flap of a bird's wings, the rustle of leaves, the groan of trees in the breeze. All of it could have been it. That thing. I kept spinning around, scanning the canopy, waiting to see those oil-black wings flicker through the branches again, but nothing came. Still, the silence wasn't comforting. It was loaded, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. By late afternoon, I found a decent clearing off the main trail and forced myself to set up camp. My hands shook as I strung up the hammock between two trees. Every creak of bark or crunch of grass felt louder than it should have. The usual hum. Fear of insects had returned, but instead of being calming, it set my teeth on edge. The forest no longer felt like a place. I'd always considered it alive in a metaphorical sense, but now it felt like it knew I was there. And it was watching. I opened a protein bar, took one bite, then tossed it aside. My appetite was gone. My stomach was too twisted up with dread to eat. When night fell, it came hard and fast, swallowing the world in a curtain of black. The Everglades. At night are their own kind of symphony. Frogs, insects, the distant yips of coyotes. But that night it all felt warped, like the world was playing itself back through a cracked speaker. I lay in my hammock with my sleeping bag zipped halfway up and my bear spray clutched in one hand. staring at the mesh above my face, eyes wide open. I didn't remember falling asleep, but when the dreams came, they came fast and hard. I was back on the trail, but the trees were wrong, longer, bending inward like they were trying to trap me. The buzzing started again, faint at first, then louder, louder until it was inside my ears. I couldn't run, I couldn't scream. I just stood there frozen as those eyes appeared from the dark, huge, wet, bottomless. They floated above me, within me, staring straight through every thought I'd ever had. I felt them wrap around my mind like tendrils. I felt myself unravel. I woke up choking, gasping so violently I almost flipped the hammock. The darkness was so absolute it took several seconds before I could tell if my eyes were even open. I lay there panting, drenched in sweat, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But my ears were ringing, not from the dream, still. A faint, residual buzz. It faded as I held my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real, that something had been hovering above me just moments before I opened my eyes. I stayed awake until dawn, wide-eyed and motionless, bear spray clenched so tightly it left imprints in my fingers. As soon as there was light, any light, I packed up camp in less than 10 minutes and hit the trail with a pace more suited to escape than travel. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to rest, just pushed forward, eyes darting from tree to tree, feeling that low vibration just at the edge of hearing, like it was following me, like it had found me once and wasn't quite finished. By the time I saw the parking lot again, I was soaked in sweat and half out of breath. Mine was the only car there. I threw my gear in the trunk, slammed the door, and locked it without thinking. And even as I started the engine, I kept looking up, half expecting to see it hovering above the tree line, staring, remembering, and worst of all, waiting. I didn't talk to anyone about what happened, not when I got home, not in the days or weeks that followed. My gear sat untouched in the garage, still caked in mud, still carrying that faint mildew scent from the swamp. I kept telling myself I was just rattled, that I'd seen something weird but explainable, some oversized insect species no one had documented yet, some trick of adrenaline and heat stroke. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't. Forget those eyes, the size of them, the weight behind them, the way they didn't just see me but understood me, even if just for a second. I stopped hiking entirely after that. I told my friends I was too busy. I lied about being out of shape. But the truth was simpler. I didn't want to be alone in the woods again. Not after knowing something like that could be out there. And if it could find me once, who's to say it couldn't again? I started avoiding quiet places altogether. Even parks near the city made me uncomfortable. Every time I heard the faintest buzzing, whether from a fly, a phone, or a flickering light, my body would lock up, breath catch in my throat. One time in the middle of the night, I woke up certain I'd heard it outside my window. Just a whisper of sound, but it was enough to have me up, pacing, peeking through the blinds like a man hunted. I started researching insects obsessively, searching forums and obscure entomology websites for anything that matched what I'd seen. I found nothing. A few close guesses from the Amazon basin or deep Southeast Asia, but even those didn't match the presence, the intelligence. Eventually, I stopped searching. I didn't want answers anymore. I just wanted it to stay a mystery, to stay gone. I still see those eyes sometimes, usually just before sleep, black, endless, reflecting not just the forest around me, but me, caught, marked, known. I never went back to the Everglades. I never will. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some things aren't meant to be seen. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.